Welcome back to another youth culture screencast where we're going to take a look at post-subcultural theory. And this is the first of two screencasts focusing on more recent research and theory on the topic of youth culture. And recent research on British youth culture has been heavily influenced by a theoretical perspective known as postmodernism. And postmodernists argue that over the last 30 years or so, society has undergone a process of cultural fragmentation. And they now see society as characterised by greater diversity, greater choice, and much greater freedom. And they claim that this greater choice and diversity has led to a process of individualisation. And individualisation is the idea that group identities, such as social class, are becoming less important, and that people now see themselves first and foremost as individuals. And I think this process of individualisation is linked to the growing importance of consumerism over the last 30 years. So I think postmodernists would argue that although group identities such as social class are still in the background, they cease to be the main steering force in how people create identities, that people's identities are now shaped by personal choice. Now, these postmodern ideas have had a huge influence on the theory and research of British youth cultures since the 1990s. So a postmodernist perspective would argue that youth styles nowadays are very fluid, that young people can choose from a range of different fashions, music tastes and identities in much the same way that people can choose from different brands and varieties when they go into a supermarket. So the argument is the boundaries between different youth cultures have become blurred. Individuals can combine different elements of a range of subcultural styles. And this perhaps means that the whole idea of discrete youth subcultures, which reflect the social background of participants, is becoming increasingly redundant. And for postmodernists, consumerism is a really important part of the construction of youth identities. And consumerism is a term that sociologists would use to describe the pressure that society puts on individuals to purchase goods and services in ever greater amounts. Now, members of older youth subcultures often couldn't afford to buy into consumerism. So older subcultures use bricolage, they use the make, do and mend approach in order to construct their identity. So earlier youth cultures, such as the punk movement, would often take second-hand clothing, maybe some new clothing, and blend things together. They would make use of everyday objects like safety pins and bin liners in order to construct a particular identity. But consumerism, which is often being fueled by the availability of cheap credit, has meant that more and more young people have been able to move away from the make, do and mend approach of earlier youth subcultures. And postmodernists would argue that we shouldn't see consumerism as a passive process. It's still an active, creative process involving what they call symbolic creativity. And this is the idea that individuals will make choices, will combine and modify the different styles and fashions that they purchase, and that this enables people to express an individual identity, to speak about themselves through their clothes, through their fashion. Now this term, the title of the screencast, Post-Subcultural theory, is the term that Bennett and Harris have used to describe the postmodernist studies of British youth cultures. And many of these studies have focused on the youth cultures that are based around dance music, which are often referred to as club cultures. And these club cultures really came to prominence with the rave scene at the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and probably in terms of their sheer numbers, the club cultures probably involved more young people than any previous youth culture. Now, one sociologist who explored these club cultures of the early 1990s from within was Sarah Thornton. So Sarah Thornton carried out ethnographic research through the use of methods such as participant observation of the dance music scene in the early 1990s. And unlike the work carried out on earlier British youth cultures by the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which remember was an approach heavily influenced by Marxism, Sarah Thornton found no evidence that these club cultures were based on the kind of class-based resistance which was highlighted by this earlier kind of Marxist work. So in contrast to earlier subcultural theory, Sarah Thornton claimed that club culture was much more about pleasure and fun than being about resistance towards capitalism. And she also argued that social class wasn't really an important component of club cultures. So she argued that club culture seemed to cut across social divisions such as class, gender, ethnicity and sexuality. In other words, to quote from Sarah Thornton, club culture dissolved structural divisions such as class, race and gender as the dance floor crowd became collectively immersed in the club experience. And I think this process of cultural fragmentation was also evident in relation to the music of this particular era. So during the late 80s, early 1990s, musical boundaries and divisions also started to break down, with indie guitar bands such as the Stone Roses and Happy Mondays from Manchester drawing upon musical and stylistic elements of dance music culture. And Sarah Thornton also stressed that unlike earlier youth subcultures, clubbing wasn't really characterised by the close-knit groups who hang around much of the time united by their common culture. So according to Sarah Thornton, club cultures are much more of a scene which people take part in on a part-time basis rather than a complete lifestyle. And she argued that the best way of understanding club cultures was to see them very much as taste cultures in which the demonstration of good taste or hipness gets you social approval and recognition. And she used this term, subcultural capital, to describe the way in which the participants in these club cultures made distinctions between good and bad taste. So those who are in the know have what she describes as subcultural capital, and this in turn gives them status and social prestige. And from the 1990s onwards, some sociologists start to question whether or not the whole concept of a subculture is a useful way of describing a group of young people who may share very little in common apart from a very loose attachment to a particular style or musical genre. And perhaps the rise of a more consumerist society has led to less rigid and more fluid social groupings based on consumerism and lifestyle choices rather than a strong attachment to a particular social class or social group. So whereas earlier youth subcultures, such as the skinhead youth subculture, were perhaps tribal in their preference for a shared uniform, a shared social background, perhaps we can characterise modern youth subcultures as neo-tribes. And the concept of a neo-tribe was coined by Maffesoli to describe social groupings with a much more loose structure than a traditional subculture. So it describes a social group based around lifestyle themes and consumer choices rather than a shared position in the social structure. And in a similar vein, Hetherington also argues that the concept of a neo-tribe is more useful than the concept of a youth subculture. So Hetherington argued that the concept of youth subcultures based on social class is no longer relevant when talking about the fluid and complex youth styles of contemporary society. So he uses this term neo-tribe to describe the more fluid associations which people can move in and out of over time. So a neo-tribe isn't a gang that hangs out on the streets. A neo-tribe is maybe just something that you do on a weekend. And Hetherington argues that neo-tribes include people with a wide variety of social class backgrounds. So in summary, neo-tribes involve participants drawn from very diverse backgrounds. Perhaps the only thing they share in common is a loose attachment to a particular style or musical genre. They're part-time. They're things that people do perhaps just on the weekend, and they're fluid. You can move kind of in and out of these groups. And like Sarah Thornton, Hetherington argues that neo-tribes are about escapism, they're about fun, they're about pleasure and hedonism, and they're not really political. They're not about the type of class-based resistance highlighted by Marxist theories. And this issue of fluidity, the idea that young people find it relatively easy to move from one group to another, is also emphasised in the work carried out on club cultures by Andy Bennett. So he argues that clubbers can go to different types of clubs on different nights, assuming whatever identity is appropriate in that location. In other words, young people don't have to feel that they need to belong to one group anymore or wear one type of uniform, that these clearly defined subcultures do not exist as much among contemporary youth, and instead young people are free to assume certain identities in particular settings. So this slide summarises some of the main differences between the kind of early work on British youth subcultures influenced by the Marxist perspective with these kind of postmodernist approaches that we've described in this screencast. Now, despite its dominance since the 1990s, post-subcultural theory has been criticised by some sociologists. So, for example, Paul Hodgkinson argues that you can't really understand a group like the Goths using the concept of a neo-tribe. Goths are much more like a traditional youth subculture requiring a particular uniform and a high degree of commitment from its members. And Blackman argues that post-subcultural theory puts far too much emphasis on consumerism at the expense of talking about resistance and the political will that young people may feel to actually change things in society. So Blackman argues that post-subcultural theory is oblivious to the political dimensions of youth that have perhaps become much more apparent since the banking crisis and the age of austerity and the end of an era of cheap credit. And finally, Rob MacDonald and Tracy Shildrek argue that post-subcultural theory is mistaken in emphasising individualism at the expense of social class. So they argue that post-subcultural theory doesn't sufficiently take into account how social class delimits subcultural opportunities, and it doesn't really take into account the way in which youth cultural styles continue to reflect social divisions based on class.